Hola, buenas tardes, señoras y señores, queridos compañeros. Muchas gracias por estar aquí hoy. Gracias de verdad por estar aquí hoy, porque muchos han optado por descansar después de los exámenes. Hoy tenemos con nosotros a Hugo López, que es profesor con una larga experiencia, actualmente director de investigación hispana en el Pew Research Center, que es un centro que estudia las actitudes y opiniones de los latinos, las visiones hispanas de la identidad, el compromiso político de los latinos en las elecciones nacionales y la juventud latina. Y va a presentarle el embajador Ramón Gil-Casares, a quien probablemente ya conozcáis todos porque lleva un tiempo con nosotros aquí en la Escuela Diplomática, que es diplomático desde 1982, licenciado en Filosofía y Letras y en Derecho por la Universidad Complutense de Madrid y que ha tenido numerosos puestos en el extranjero, como por ejemplo Guinea Ecuatorial, Uruguay, Filipinas, cónsul general adjunto de España en Nueva York. En España ha sido secretario de Estado de Asuntos Exteriores, entre otros puestos, embajador también en la República de Sudáfrica y, lo más importante para el acto que hoy nos concierne, es que ha sido embajador de España en Washington hasta hace muy poco. Y el embajador Gil-Casares es quien ha tenido la amabilidad de presentar hoy a Hugo López, nuestro huésped. Embajador, tienes la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Helena. Yo estoy aquí porque conozco a Marc, no por otra cosa, de mi época de Estados Unidos. Yo no voy a ser muy largo, simplemente quiero decirles que uno de los fenómenos más importantes que se han producido en los últimos 10 años en los Estados Unidos, incluida la elección del presidente Trump, es la aparición del fenómeno hispano. Es decir, la población de origen hispano en Estados Unidos ha alcanzado unos números, una fuerza y una representación en todos los sectores, tanto los sociales como el económico y el político, con congresistas, senadores, representantes en el Congreso, gobernadores, la aparición de canales hispanos en la televisión, periódicos hispanos, los que ha trabajado mucho Hugo López, lo ha hecho importantísimo. Y para España, este es un fenómeno que cambia nuestras relaciones con los Estados Unidos. Primero porque es una población absolutamente norteamericana, que se siente absolutamente norteamericana y no de otra parte, pero que acaso tenga una conexión y una posibilidad de entender España mejor que otras, en las que nosotros tendríamos que apoyarnos. Para nosotros es una ventaja esencial que estén ellos ahí. Y el problema es que no les hemos estudiado mucho, no los entendemos muchos y muchas veces no los valoramos o los malinterpretamos. Durante los 5 años que tuve el honor de ser embajador de España ante los Estados Unidos, hablé mucho con asociaciones de hispanos y para aclararnos muchas veces invitamos a Hugo López. Incluso el ministro García Margallo tuvo el placer de escucharle en la residencia de la Embajada de España en alguna ocasión y estoy seguro que ustedes van a disfrutar con las explicaciones que le van a dar sobre este fenómeno, que es el fenómeno hispano, que, como digo, es esencial y del que es especialista. Hugo López, the floor is absolutely yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm actually going to move to the podium so I can talk to you a little bit better and also stand up and engage you a little bit. But let me first get the presentation going here. My apologies.
You can have this so that you move around.
Oh, perfect. This is even better. Is it on? Yes, it is.
It is going.
Great. Okay. And it looks like you're going to get to see my presentation in total. Backwards. Okay. My name is Mark Lopez, and I'm the Director of Hispanic Research at the Pew Research Center here at in Washington, D.C. Here I am here in Washington. Sorry, I'm a little discombobulated at the moment trying to get everything working here. I want to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing on Latinos in the United States. And I'm going to move over here to the podium just so that you can see the presentation and also see me at the same time. But first, before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the Pew Research Center and who we are. The Pew Research Center is located in Washington, D.C. We call ourselves a fact tank. Now that's different than a think tank. And that's actually on purpose. We do a lot of work, just like any think tank would, looking at facts, trends, data, etc. But what we don't do is take positions on policy. So you will not see from the Pew Research Center any recommendations on what Congress should do, what the president should do. We don't make any recommendations to candidates. We are nonpartisan and non-advocacy. So we just simply present the facts and we don't take any positions. So as you're looking at our work, you may want to think about that as you're looking at some of the data that I show you. Also, I understand there's going to be questions towards the end, and in those questions, some questions may be things that I would be unable to answer because we're nonpartisan, non-advocacy, so I may not be able to give you an answer to some stuff, and if that happens, I'll say, I don't know. But that's meant to give you a sense of there's some things that we don't have hard data for, and if we don't have hard data for it, it's something that we generally don't talk about. So, let me get started, and I look forward to our conversation. So first, the U.S. Latino community numbers 57 million people. It's a number that's been growing pretty fast, and in fact, for many decades, the U.S. Hispanic population was the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States. But that's no longer the case. The U.S. Hispanic population's growth rate has slowed almost in half from what it was just a few years ago. And while it's still growing, it's growing at a slower rate. So today, the number stands at 57 million. Actually, that's from 2015. We're probably at more like 58 million now, maybe even 59 million in 2017. But it's a fast-growing population whose rate of growth is exceeded only by Asian Americans in the United States at the moment. It's also a diverse community, a community that has diversity along a number of different lines. And this is one of the ways in which the community is diverse. When you take a look at the Hispanic population in the United States, people trace their roots to many different countries. So, for example, people of Mexican origin, there's about 33 million plus of them in the United States. That includes people who are either born in Mexico or people who trace their roots to Mexico. They make up about 2/3 of the nation's Hispanic population. That's followed by Puerto Ricans at about 10%. Salvadorans and Cubans are at about 3% each of the U.S. Hispanic population. They're number 3 and number 4. And then there's a bunch of other groups below that, all of which have at least 1 million people. You'll see I also have in this chart, though, the number of people who trace their roots to Spain. So what's the share, or how many Hispanics say they are of Spanish origin? That's about 750,000 people in total. And it's a number that reflects two things. It reflects first people who were born in Spain who now live in the United States, so Spanish immigrants. But it also reflects people who have roots in the Southwest, who trace their roots to the original Spanish settlers in New Mexico, in Arizona, in Colorado, in Texas. Many of those folks refer to themselves as of Spanish origin, and yet they are not necessarily Spanish speakers. So it's interesting how diverse the U.S. Hispanic community is, and it's something that I think really makes the community unique in a number of ways. Now, about Salvadorans and Cubans. A little bit of a story, because I have a feeling you might like this story. For the longest time, Cubans were the 3rd largest Hispanic group in the United States. But it looks like that's about to change. Now, the Salvadoran and Cuban numbers are indistinguishable from each other statistically speaking. What I mean by that is we have an estimate of how big each population is, but they're estimates. As a result, we can't distinguish them apart from each other because they're so close together. What's interesting here is that a few years ago, I showed a slide like this to a group of Salvadoran leaders, people in the United States who trace their roots to El Salvador. And as soon as I put the slide up, they started chanting, "We're number 3. We're number 3." Because they were really excited to have passed up their Cuban counterparts to become the 3rd largest Hispanic group. That same day, though, because we had put a report out about this, a Cuban American reporter had said to me when I told her that story, her reaction was, "Oh my God, we need to have more children." So the reaction from the Cuban American was really interesting as well, sort of having seen this possibility of becoming the 4th largest Hispanic group after decades of being number 3. What's also interesting about this is that the U.S. government has done a lot to recognize this diversity and now actually counts and displays information for Salvadorans separately, partly as a result of some of these developments in the process. So just a little bit about the diversity of the community. The community is also dispersed around the United States. This map shows you where Latinos live. So you can get a really good sense of where the biggest Hispanic communities are. You can see South Florida is one. The U.S.-Mexico border has a lot of Latinos. New York City, Chicago, those are all places with large Hispanic populations. The point being that the Hispanic population in the United States is dispersed across most counties. So most places that have population in the U.S. have a Hispanic presence. And this is really one of the big stories of the Latino community. It's not only been about its fast growth, but it's also been about its dispersion around the country. Now, we also have been asking Hispanics about how they feel about the community's progress. So how do they think things have gone for the community recently? And you could see that attitudes about the direction of the community have changed somewhat. Now, this is based off of a survey of Hispanic adults that we did in late December of 2016 into early January of 2017, before Donald Trump was inaugurated as president. And what we found is that a growing share of Hispanics say that things have gotten worse for the community. Today, about 32% say that things are worse than they were before. And you can see that the share that say things have improved, that say things that are better, has declined. So there's a sense in the community that perhaps things have gotten worse in the last year or so. Now, we didn't connect that necessarily to Donald Trump in this question, but the election may have had something to do with some of the answers that we got from our respondents in our survey. But more on that in just a little bit. Now, I want to talk to you about some of the big trends that are reshaping the community, because the whole purpose of this talk is to talk to you about not just how many Latinos live in the United States, but also what's actually changing that community and how is it changing. Well, first, the population is growing still, but its rate of growth is slowing. In addition, its dispersion across the United States, that too has slowed down. We've also seen, though, some other very interesting trends as well. The U.S. Hispanic population is growing not because immigrants are coming to the country so much, as it's growing because more Latinos or more babies are born in the United States. So U.S. births are now the principal source of growth for this population. What's also interesting is that Mexican immigration, the number of immigrants coming from Mexico to the United States, that has slowed so much that now there are actually more Mexican immigrants leaving the United States in any given year than are arriving as new immigrants. That's the first time we've seen that since the 1940s. So that gives you some sense of how big historically this particular point is. In addition, as a result of all those changes, the share of the U.S. Hispanic population that is foreign-born is now in decline. We oftentimes think of U.S. Hispanics as an immigrant population, but the share of foreign-born is falling as immigration from Latin America slows dramatically. That U.S.-born Hispanic population, though, is also interesting because of how young it is. So when you look at the U.S. Hispanic population, you'll find that among those born in the United States, half are under the age of 19. So if you think about that, the majority of U.S.-born Hispanics, the majority of the U.S. Hispanic population is U.S.-born, and half of that population is under the age of 19. In other words, they haven't really entered adulthood yet. They're still kids. And that really gives you some sense about the potential of this community, that it is a community that is growing, maybe more slowly, but it's also quite young, and its future is still ahead of it. And then finally, as a result of some of these changes, we are seeing English use on the rise. What I mean by this is that there's still a growing number of Hispanics who speak Spanish at home in the United States, but a growing share, particularly of U.S.-born young Latinos, are the ones who are growing up in households where only English is spoken. So some very interesting developments in terms of trends that are affecting the community, and let me illustrate some of those for you here. First, about growth rates. You can see how the growth rate for Hispanic population in the United States has slowed. It was at about 4.4% prior to the Great Recession per year, and now it's about 2.8% now. So some of the big differences here are really a slowdown in immigration. That's really the big reason why we see this decline, though fertility rates for Hispanic women as well are falling. When you take a look at the dispersion of the Hispanic population, you can see where it's growing fastest. That's the dark purple counties. And you can see where it's growing kind of fast. That's the lighter purple counties. But you should know that the Hispanic population is not growing everywhere. It's actually declining in some parts of the country. And those are places that are traditional Hispanic counties, places in New Mexico, West Texas, and Colorado. Some of the oldest standing Hispanic populations are there, but there are also places that are seeing some population declines. But you can see that in terms of the dispersion, some of the fastest growth in Hispanic population recently has been in the South. Places like Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee. Those have been some of the big places where we've seen some real growth. When it comes to the sources of growth for Hispanics, you can see in this chart, and this shows you in terms of millions, what were the sources of Hispanic population growth in different decades. So for example, in the 1970s, immigration and births were just about equal in contributing to Hispanic population growth. But in the 1980s and the 1990s, it was the arrival of new immigrants that mattered more for Hispanic population growth than births to Hispanic parents. But in the 2000s, that flipped. Now it is U.S. births that are more important for population growth than is the arrival of new immigrants. So this story of immigration, births, sources of growth, they're all tied together, and they're all together contributing to the stories that I'm telling you here about Hispanic population growth and change. Now, that foreign-born share has been in decline for a while now, and you can see this here in this chart, which shows you not only for the Hispanic population that the share of foreign-born has gone from about 40% in 2000 to about 35% now, but we also see a decline in the foreign-born share for each origin group of Hispanics. Guatemalans are seeing a decline in their foreign-born share. Cubans, same thing. When you take a look at Dominicans, when you take a look at Salvadorans, all of these groups together are experiencing a decline in their foreign-born share. It is not just a phenomenon that's unique to Mexicans, but it's something that's across the board. When we take a look, though, at also one of the big changes that's happened in America recently, did you know that with this decline in immigration from Latin America, the number of new arrivals coming to the United States, the number of immigrant new arrivals, is actually now being driven by Asian immigrants. So there are now more Asians coming in any given year to the United States than there are people from Latin America. To go even further, when you take a look at, say, the specific countries, in the most recent years, India, followed by China, have outpaced Mexico as a source for new immigrants in the United States. This is really a reversal from what we'd seen for about 40 years, where Latin America was the principal source of new immigrants for the United States. That's no longer the case. Asia is now the principal source of new immigrants to the United States. And with regards to Mexico, this chart really gives you a sense of what has happened to Mexican migration. You can see that during the 1995 to 2000 period, many more Mexicans arrived in the United States than left. The light gray bar is the arrivals. The red bar is those people who've decided to leave the United States. Look at the period between 2005 and 2010. Just about equal. Number coming, number going, just about the same. But a real drop in the number of Mexican immigrants choosing to come to the United States. What about 2009 to 2014? Here's where we see the reversal. Now note that it is a reversal, but it is a slight reversal. It is not like there's a sudden 2 million Mexicans deciding to leave the United States and go back home to Mexico. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is that the number choosing to leave is slightly larger than the number who are choosing to arrive or to come to the United States. But nonetheless, the number leaving the United States is greater now than the number coming into the United States. And that's really, again, the first time we've seen that since the 1940s. Fascinating stuff, huh? Everybody looks so intense, they're staring at all the charts. What about Mexican immigrant population numbers? Well, this is really interesting. And, you know, if you ever go with me if you go to a cocktail party or we go have some wine, I'm going to tell you all kinds of facts. So if you hang out with me, you're going to hear nothing but facts. And this is one of my favorite facts that I like to share, which is, did you know that there are more Mexican immigrants living in the United States than any other country has of immigrants? Let me say that again. We have about 11.5, almost 12 million Mexican immigrants, so the number has declined. But no other country in the world has as many immigrants as the United States has just immigrants from Mexico. In total, the United States has about 44 million immigrants, and Mexicans are the single largest group. Looked at another way, about one in every 10, 1 in every 11 people born in Mexico worldwide live in the United States. And 95% of all Mexican immigrants choose to go to the United States as their destination. So this relationship with Mexico and immigration is really quite large between the United States and Mexico. But the population of Mexican immigrants, it's now in decline. You can see that it started with the Great Recession, where we hit, right before that, we were over 12 million Mexican immigrants living in the United States. Now we're at about 11-something million, so we're down about 1 million people since its peak. This is really, again, a big reversal and a quick reversal from where we were just a few years ago. You should also know that many of these Mexican immigrants are in the United States without authorization. About half of that Mexican immigrant population are unauthorized immigrants. In other words, people who are in the United States illegally. But Mexico isn't the only story, and I think it's important to stress that the Latino community of the United States is a group that is very diverse, with diverse stories. So while Mexican immigration may be in decline, that's not the case for Cuban immigration. In fact, we started to see a rise in the number of Cubans trying to get to the United States. Now this chart shows you the pattern annually all the way through 2016. Part of the reason for the growth between 2014 and 2016 is relations started to warm between the United States and Cuba. And there was a lot of talk that the Obama administration might eventually eliminate its wet foot, dry foot policy that was favorable to Cuban immigrants. In other words, if a Cuban immigrant could get to the United States, it was much easier for them to have a path towards citizenship than immigrants from other countries in the world. Now, eventually, the Obama administration did eliminate that policy. So that policy has been eliminated. But in anticipation of that, there was a surge in immigration from Cuba to the United States. You probably heard stories about people getting stuck in Nicaragua, people getting stuck in Central America, or making the trek through Mexico to try to cross the U.S.-Mexico border, in addition to people trying to cross through the Straits of Florida to get to South Florida or Puerto Rico or somewhere in the Caribbean in order to get to the United States to be able to claim asylum. I want to stress, though, that again, this isn't just a story about Mexicans and Cubans. There are also Puerto Rican stories, too, to tell. And here the story is one about out-migration. Now, the island of Puerto Rico is part of the United States. It's a territory of the United States. As such, people born on the island of Puerto Rico are U.S. citizens by birth. Now, what's interesting here is that as the economy in Puerto Rico has really declined, in fact, it's been shrinking, the population on the island has been leaving. And in fact, we have more people leaving the island now than we have seen on an annual basis since the Great Migration of the 1950s. So this is a huge migration. This is really a big population story. It also means that the island of Puerto Rico is losing population. Did you know that it was at about 3.5 million people in 2000? So 3.5 million people lived on the island in 2000. Today, that number is about only 3 million. So that gives you some sense of how quick this decline in population has been. Where do they go? Well, about 1/3 resettle in Florida. And I want you to think about that when we talk about politics in a little bit. Another third or so settle in places like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, which is a traditionally large Puerto Rican origin population. And interestingly, Texas is another destination for many of these out-migrants. But the story of Puerto Rico is really one that's developing and continues to change as we see an acceleration in the number of people choosing to leave the island. You should know, by the way, there's going to be a plebiscite this summer in Puerto Rico about the status of the island. Should it become a state? Should it be a country, etc.? It'll be very interesting to see what happens. Getting back to youth, this chart shows you how young Latinos are compared to everybody else in the United States. A median age of Latinos is much younger than it is for any other group of Americans. So just so you can see how young Latinos are. And this shows you how young, particularly U.S.-born Latinos are. Did you know that about 3/4 of U.S.-born Latinos are millennials or younger? That is, they're under the age of 35. Think about how young that population is. We're talking about a population of people that's essentially still coming of age. And this is really something that's unique for Latinos compared to other groups. No other group is really quite as young as Latinos are. And it's the U.S.-born who are really driving those numbers. But what about language? Well, when it comes to language, these US-born Latinos are actually growing up in households today that are more likely to be English only than their older counterparts. So you can see that among those ages 5 to 18, the share that speak only English at home is at 37%. But that's higher than it is for any other group, any other age group of Latinos. And really, I think this is a sign of things to come, that the Hispanic population is changing, that it's becoming more rooted in the United States, that it really is about an American experience, and as a result, English is more prevalent among this group as a first language. Now, we wanted to look at, of course, language in other ways here for the at the Pew Research Center, because the slide that I just showed you on language was from data based on the Census Bureau. And the U.S. Census Bureau asked people the following question: do you speak a language other than English at home? And if they say yes, they ask you what language, and then so Spanish. Then they ask you, how well do you speak English? So those questions really only measure fluency in English, not necessarily in another language. So what we want to do in our surveys at Pew Research is to ask Latinos how well they can speak Spanish, read and write in Spanish, and then the same two questions about English. That allows us to develop these categories of Spanish dominant, bilingual, and English dominant. I think one thing to take away from this slide is, first, what share of Latinos are Spanish dominant? About over a third, but not a majority of Latinos are Spanish dominant. So this is adults. But when you take a look at it by immigrant generation, immigrant Hispanics, more than half are Spanish dominant. But when you get to third or higher generation Hispanics, people like myself, US-born with US-born parents, you can see that the share that are English dominant is over 7 in 10. So when we're talking about that third generation, that US-born parents generation, it is really an English-dominant generation as opposed to their immigrant counterparts who are largely a Spanish-dominant population. The group in the middle, the second generation, these are US-born children of immigrant parents. What's interesting about them is that about half of them are bilingual. Makes sense. They're people who grew up in households with immigrant parents, so they probably grew up speaking Spanish, but they also went to school in the United States, so they speak English as well. As a result, this is a bilingual group, and I think it makes a lot of sense to see these changes across the generations. You should know that the second and third generation are where growth is happening in the community. So in the United States, we're probably going to see many more Latinos English dominant in the coming years. What about identity? This is a big question that I've been having a lot of conversations with people about here in Madrid over the course of the last day. And it's really interesting because people are interested in how Hispanics in the United States see their identity. Do they identify as American? Do they identify with their countries of origin? Do they see themselves as Hispanic or Latino, this pan-ethnic identity? But as you can see here, US-born Latinos particularly are more likely to be somewhat mixed in their identities. Many say they're American. Many will say that more often than not they call themselves by their country of origin terms. Can I get a glass of water? I'm sorry. Sorry about that. Been talking a lot today. And so kind of losing my voice a little bit. Molly, I sure hope that I'm going to be okay for tomorrow. We'll see what happens. Because I have even more presentations tomorrow. So thank you very much. So when you talk about identity, one of the things that's interesting here is that, yes, immigrant Hispanics, they will most often call themselves by their country of origin names, Dominican, Cuban, etc. But those who are US-born are less likely to do so and are more likely to call themselves most often as an American, which I think is an important thing to note here, that among the US-born, the links to the home country, while still somewhat strong, are perhaps not as strong as they are with their immigrant parents. Perhaps that's no surprise, but that's something that we found in our data. Now, what about the election? So when we talk about the election, I think one of the interesting things about this election is sort of what happened with regards to the Latino vote. Because if you follow U.S. elections, every election cycle, there's a lot of discussion about this is going to be the year that the Hispanic vote is going to, and then you fill in the blank. I think what's interesting to note, though, is sort of what are some of the facts, what are some of the trends we were seeing, and what actually happened in this last election. So first, Did you know there were 27 plus million Hispanics who were at least 18 years of age and a U.S. citizen? That means they're eligible to vote. That number was up by 4 million over the previous election cycle. So a lot of growth in the number of potential Hispanic voters. Trump made a lot of comments, and Trump was a Republican presidential candidate. He made a lot of comments through the course of the election about Mexican immigrants, about Mexicans in general, about immigrants in general, about Muslims as well, about many other groups. And many commentators in the United States were saying that these comments that Trump made about Mexicans, about Hispanics, might be a big motivator to get Latinos out to the polls, because many of the comments were not the most positive comments. As a result, there was a real big drive to do two things. The first was to have many Hispanic immigrants who are in the United States legally, about 5 million people, actually sign up to become U.S. citizens. Because when you become a U.S. citizen, you can vote. So there were citizenship drives to get Hispanic immigrants eligible to naturalize to actually sign up and become a U.S. citizen in time to vote in the November election. What actually happened? I'll show you some data. There was also a lot of efforts launched to get Latinos to register to vote. Now, this isn't anything new. We've had a lot of efforts to launched at getting out registration drives in every presidential election cycle, even congressional election cycles. But there was a lot of attention to this because there was a belief that this was perhaps a real opportunity with Trump's comments, an opportunity to capitalize on them and get many Latinos who might not have otherwise registered to register. Contrast all of that with where we are with the view Latinos have of the Republican Party and of Republican candidates. Our surveys at Pew Research have long shown that the image of the Republican Party among Hispanic registered voters has been low. So, for example, in this election cycle, only 12% of Hispanic registered voters said that the Republican Party has more concern for the Latino community than the Democratic Party. Now, that number is little changed over a course of a decade or more of polling. And so already going into this election cycle, the image of the Republican Party was already quite low, despite Trump's comments. And interestingly, as the election got closer, the narrative around the Latino vote turned from one of, are Latinos going to register? Are they going to show up? To one of Latinos are showing up in record numbers. And particularly in Florida, there was a lot of interest in some of the early vote numbers, which suggested that Latinos were showing up to vote in record numbers early. Now, one of the things I think it's important to note is that while that may be the case that we did see a rise in the number of Latinos voting early, we saw a rise in the number of people overall voting early in Florida. So the Latino story isn't something that's necessarily unique. It was something happening across the board. Nonetheless, it fed into a narrative about the Latino vote that suggested Latinos were going to show up in record numbers in a way that was unprecedented or for an election cycle. Now, did that actually happen? Let's find out. Sorry, let me take another drink of water. Everybody doing okay out there? I see everybody looking intensely at the charts. Where are we with the Latino vote? Well, as you can see, 27.3 million Hispanics eligible to vote. We actually don't have numbers yet for how many Hispanics voted in the election. That's to come in about 2 to 3 weeks, so we will be able to fill in this data point once that data becomes available. But notice that every election cycle has had a record turnout of Hispanics. We've been hitting records regularly. But you might wonder why. Big reason is that the Hispanic population is growing. If you have more potential voters, you're going to have more voters. And so the Hispanic vote has become a growing part of the U.S. electorate as the Hispanic population itself grows. I'm sorry. Excuse me. Now, a lot of that growth comes from Latino youth. And this chart really shows you where we were in 2012, where we were in 2016, and the contributions to growth that Latino youth played. So of that 4 million additional potential voters, About 3 million of that came from young Latinos who entered adulthood. So going back to that U.S.-born story, do you see how important youth is for even affecting politics among Latinos? You can see it here in another way, that many Latinos are millennials or younger. So many of the potential eligible voters for Hispanics are millennials or younger, about 44%. That's higher than it is among whites, blacks, or Asians. So again, to show you how important youth is for the Latino vote. In terms of citizenship applications, here is a chart which shows you the annual number of citizenship applications submitted to the United States government by immigrants. You can see that there was an increase for 2016. We did have an increase, but the increase, excuse me, sorry, one more time.
Some more here.
Thank you. I may need some more. We did see an increase in citizenship applications. There's no doubt about that. But the increase, while somewhat high, isn't any different, frankly, than what we would have seen between 11 and 12. Now, I don't have 11 here to really show you that, but certainly we were up 8% over the previous presidential election cycle. And while that's a little bit of an increase, it isn't the increase that many were predicting. Many thought we'd have over 1 million citizenship applications. We didn't reach 1 million. What about in terms of attitudes about the parties? This is a chart that shows you where we were in terms of which party Latinos think has more concern for the Hispanic community. You can see the Democrats have a big advantage, but that their advantage is one that's sort of gone up and down as a growing share or a shrinking share of Latinos say that there's no difference between the two parties. But nonetheless, the Republican Party has long had a poor image among Latinos, and this chart shows you how long we've been measuring this, all the way back to 2002, and there's been very little change in the image that Latinos have of the Republican Party. What about voter turnout rates? Latinos traditionally have low voter turnout rates. In 2012, the voter turnout rate for Hispanics actually declined compared with 2008. So 48% of Latinos voted in 2012, about half voted in 2008. Where are we going to be this year? It remains to be seen. It's possible that we'll be above 48%, but we haven't seen the numbers yet to really determine where we are for this. But it's unlikely that the Latino voter turnout rate exceeded that of whites or blacks. And you can see that particularly in 2012, the black voter turnout rate actually exceeded that of whites for the first time. And what about the presidential vote? Well, this shows you, at least through 2012, the pattern of voting for presidential candidates. As you can see, Democrats have always won the Latino vote, at least back into the 1980s. Barack Obama won in 2012 with 71% of the Latino vote to Mitt Romney's 27%. So why do we care about that? Well, when you take a look at, I'm going to come back to it, when you take a look at what happened in 2016, I'll show you what happened, why we need to know that data point. Latino voters also are concentrated in some states that are not important or not key for the presidential election. So for example, California and Texas, which together have half of all Hispanic voters, are two states that weren't battleground states in 2012. In fact, they were important in many ways for local elections, but they didn't get the attention from presidential candidates that you saw, say, in a state like Florida. Florida, on the other hand, is one of those states where there is a large Latino presence. And it's a state that's also a key battleground state. It's been one for a number of years now, not just in 2016. So when you take a look at the Latino vote, in many cases, Latinos live in places that are not getting the same level of attention from presidential candidates that you see in states like Florida. So, in terms of Florida, just to give you some sense, this is the third largest Hispanic population among the states, and it also has 9% of all Hispanics overall. So it gives you some sense of how important it is. It's also a diverse population with a lot of Cubans, Venezuelans, Colombians, etc. So it's a population that is diverse in a number of ways, but Cubans have long been the dominant group in this particular state. It also has the largest Hispanic battleground population, and as a result, there was a lot of interest in the Hispanic vote in Florida this year, with a lot of effort to register people in Miami-Dade, which is where Cubans live, and also in Central Florida, where the out-migration of Puerto Ricans, many were settling. So many were settling in the Central Florida area. Now, the November election was really quite interesting. According to the National Exit Poll, the Latino vote went with 66% support for Hillary Clinton and 28% for Donald Trump. So Hillary Clinton did win the Latino vote, and she won it by a wide margin. I think that what's interesting here is that it doesn't look like Donald Trump did any worse than Mitt Romney did in 2012. So a lot of folks are like, wait a minute, how can it be that Latinos, after all that Donald Trump said, would even vote for him? Well, it looks like a significant number of Hispanic voters in the end did vote for Donald Trump. Now, there is some controversy about this number, and I don't want to say that this number of 28% is a solid number. It is an estimate of what share of Hispanic voters voted for Donald Trump. But there are other estimates out there which range from anywhere from 18% for Donald Trump to the exit polls 28%. So there is a range of estimates, but you should know that no matter what, Donald Trump won at least 1 in 5 Hispanic voters. So when you take a look at this, Donald Trump may have done at least as well as Mitt Romney, perhaps worse than Mitt Romney, but if he was at 18%, that would not be much worse than the lowest we ever saw, which was with Bob Dole in 1996, when he won only 21% of the Latino vote. Nonetheless, there's been a lot of controversy about exactly how many Latinos voted for Donald Trump. Now, Latinos were also 11% of the electorate. That would suggest that they're up as a share of voters. So Latinos probably did increase their share among voters. I don't know exactly by how much. We need more data, but this is one of the data points from the exit poll. It's also likely that turnout hit about 13 million people. Now, this would be on track with what we normally would see in terms of demographic growth. So with demographic growth, we would expect about 13 million voters. Now, again, we don't have the hard data yet. We're waiting for those data points to come out. Once we have them, we'll be able to fill it in. But it's likely we saw a record turnout just because there were many more Hispanics who could vote. And when you asked Hispanic voters, what were their top issues? Number one was the economy, not immigration. So immigration didn't rate as a top issue for Hispanic voters. And I put that out there because I think it's important to talk about the community and how diverse it is. It is not just a community that is concerned about only one issue. Our surveys have long shown that issues like the economy and education oftentimes top immigration as a top issue. Here's the comparison of the vote according to the exit polls for Latinos over the course of the last 3 election cycles. And you can see Hillary Clinton's win looks an awful lot like Obama's win in 2008. In terms of Cubans, you can see that among Cubans in Florida, 54% voted for Donald Trump. This actually reverses a trend we'd seen of Cubans giving their support in growing numbers to Democratic presidential candidates through the course of the last 10 years, particularly with Barack Obama. But now Trump won a majority of the Cuban vote in Florida. The interesting thing about this is that the Trump victory was in many ways one where he did better than he did at least as well, as Romney did in the previous election cycle. And this was something that was true not just for Hispanics, but for whites and blacks as well. Now, I want to close by showing you some of our latest data. The Pew Research Center regularly does surveys of Latinos in the United States. And we did a survey of Latinos, as I noted earlier, in December of 2016 into January of 2017. A survey that was intended to ask Hispanics about their reactions to the election, on the one hand, where they see the community today, but also what are the most important issue priorities for the new administration and for the new Congress. And here's what we found. So we found that among the issues of most importance that Latinos see for top priorities, education was number one. 73% said that should be a top priority for the new administration and the new Congress. That's followed by terrorism and strengthening the nation's economy. Number 4 on our list was healthcare, and last was immigration. Now, the immigration result is really interesting because 46% of Latino adults say that this should be a top priority for the new Congress and the new administration. among the general U.S. public, 43% said immigration should be a top issue for the new Congress and the new president. What's interesting about this is it has oftentimes been the case that Latinos rate this issue more highly than the general public. But here, for this year, we saw them rating it at about the same rate. So just keep that in mind as you take a look at these issues, because in many respects, the issue priority list for Latinos looks a lot like the general U.S. public. What about how Latinos feel about their place in America after Trump's victory? We also said, do you have serious concerns about your place in America, or are you confident about your place in America? This was a question that we asked in this survey, and here's what we found. Among all Latinos, 54% said that they are confident about their place in America. 41%, however, said they have some serious concerns about their place in America after Donald Trump's election. Keep in mind this survey was done before Donald Trump's inauguration. So this is before he took office. This numbers may be different today, given a number of things that have happened since Donald Trump has become president. Now, who is most concerned about their place in the country after Donald Trump's election? Latino immigrants who do not have U.S. citizenship. Those are the last two bars. And when you take a look at those who are lawful permanent residents, these are immigrants who have a green card, for example, 49% say they have serious concerns about their place in America. What about among those who are not citizens and not residents? These are likely undocumented immigrants. When you ask them, you'll find that 55% say they have serious concerns about their place in America. So overall, taking a look at these results, those who do not have U.S. citizenship express more concern about their place in America after Donald Trump's election than those who have citizenship. This same pattern also goes into the question that we asked about deportations. Do you worry that you yourself or someone you know might be deported? This is a question we've been asking for some time, and it's been somewhat stable over the years. And this is really, these results are no different than what we've seen in the previous time that we asked this question. But when you take a look at this, you'll see that among all Latinos, 47% say they worry a lot or some, that somebody they know or they themselves might be deported. When you take a look at the who's most concerned or who expresses this point of view the most, again, it's U.S. immigrant Latinos who do not have U.S. citizenship. About 2/3 of both the lawful permanent residents and those who are likely undocumented say they are worried a lot or some that they themselves or somebody they know might be deported. I'm going to stop there because that was a lot of numbers. And I'm losing my voice. But I look forward to your questions and I look forward to our discussion. And you should know that I really enjoy this part of a presentation, that is hearing the questions you have to ask. And so I look forward to them and I look forward to our engagement. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Lopez.
Hi.
When we read about the American elections, we read about the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon people, Protestant people in the U.S. And I would like to know if there is a similar group within the Latino population. There is, what is the role of religion in the electoral behavior of the Latino population? Thank you.
It's a great question. The nation's Hispanic community is a diverse community in a number of ways. And it's also a community that has a growing share who have no religious affiliation, and a lot of that is really U.S.-born young people who are driving that number, but also has a growing share who are evangelical. And in fact, many of the Puerto Ricans who've moved from the island to Florida are evangelical Christians. For them, interestingly, this election was one where we saw a change in patterns as well. In 2008 and in 2012, Barack Obama won a majority of the Latino evangelical vote, according to our surveys. That's interesting because traditionally they'd been a very Republican group, but he just slightly won a majority in both of those elections. In 2012, things reversed. Trump won a majority of the evangelical vote among Hispanics in 2016. At least that's what our surveys were indicating was going to happen. This is really, in having talked with a lot of folks, a reflection of the role of the issue of abortion. And for many evangelical Hispanics, this is a key issue, an issue that they supported Donald Trump. The reason why they supported Donald Trump is because of his position on abortion. And this is something that I heard a lot traveling around the country. So you're right to say that when we talk about the Latino vote is not monolithic. It's actually a diverse group of people, and they have diverse opinions, and they vote for different reasons on different things. And for this election cycle, it appears Donald Trump was able to win a significant enough share of the evangelical and also the Cuban vote that helped propel him to win states like Florida. So this is really, I think, a reflection of the diversity of the Hispanic vote, particularly when it comes to some different political issues. Good question. You're welcome.
Thanks very much for your talk. I spent a semester in Philadelphia at UPenn, and I couldn't help but notice that we were not seen as Hispanic or Latino, we Spaniards. As a matter of fact, also, and he comes in anecdotal evidence, there's this popular song, a Latino song in the United States, and which is also heard here, listened to here, which is called La Gozadera, which mentions all Latin American countries, but spectacularly fails to mention Spain. Also, for example, one of the 21 judges whose names were mentioned regarding the nomination of for the U.S. Supreme Court happens to be the son of a Spanish man, of a Spaniard, Judge Moreno from Florida. And there was, in terms of reciprocity, there was absolutely no mention in the Spanish media of that fact. So
in the U.S. Spanish media.
Yeah, I assume so. And the point being that I'm under the impression that, and there's some reciprocity here, that although the Latino population feels a certain attachment to a Latino concept, we're not part of that. Do you have any evidence in that sense?
So in our surveys, we ask people when we conduct them, and we're screening for the population we're trying to interview, this Hispanic or Latino population, we ask people, do you consider yourself Hispanic or Latino? If they say yes, we count them as Hispanic or Latino. That means we're getting Spaniards in our surveys, and the Spaniards consider themselves in the United States Hispanic or Latino. We're going to count them as such. The Census Bureau of the United States does the same thing. People are asked, what are you? Are you white, black, whatever, or are you Hispanic, Latino, whatever? If you answer yes to Hispanic or Latino, they count you as Hispanic or Latino. And to give you an example of how this works, a good friend of mine loves Mexican food. He loves Mexican culture. He thinks Mexico is fantastic. So, I said to him, let's go visit Ireland, which is his home country or his origin country, and then we'll go visit Mexico, mine, right? We spent 10 days in Ireland. We only spent a weekend in Mexico, and I thought he was short shrifting my folks. But he came back and he loved Mexico. He's like, oh, I don't ever want to go to Ireland again. It's so boring. There's nothing going on in Ireland. But the census was coming up in 2010. So I said to him, you love Mexico so much, why don't you say you're Hispanic? You should. They're not going to question it. You should claim it if you want to be Hispanic. You love the culture so much. He said no. But the point being that if you say you're Hispanic or Latino, we count you as such in the United States. It's what you say you are. So there is, though, a group of folks, there is a lot of folks in particularly Latin American studies programs who will do exactly what you just described. So, for example, there's one particular center that I know of that reworks the Hispanic definition from the Census Bureau's data. What they'll do is they'll do the following. Number one, they will include all Brazilians in the Hispanic Latino count, because many Brazilians will not say they're Hispanic or Latino. They think it's really a Spanish language concept and not a Latin American concept. So they'll move the Brazilians into the category of Hispanic or Latino. But they will remove the Spaniards. Anybody who's born in Spain or says they're of Spanish origin, they take those folks out because they don't think they are part of, and they prefer the word Latino population, and so they make that choice. But I want to stress that at the Census Bureau, at the Pew Research Center, and many other research centers around the country in the United States, it's really taking people at their word. If you say you're Hispanic or Latino, that's how we're going to count you. But I will say, yes, you're right. There is some movements within the Latino community that don't want to count Spaniards as part of this broader pan-ethnic identity for Hispanics in the United States. But the United States government The work of many organizations like ours oftentimes take people at their word. If you say you are, we count you as such. That was a long answer. Sorry about that.
My name is Aurora, and I wanted to ask about identity and language, because I was reading the numbers and I just saw that third and fourth generation Hispanic immigrants do not speak Spanish, or they're not as fluent as their parents. And I'd like to know, is this because of a choice that families make because they just want to integrate, or is this because there's a lack of policies, there's no Spain at school, and if this tendency continues this way, at some point, once people stop speaking Spanish, they will also stop feeling Hispanic somehow.
Yeah.
And maybe this all phenomenon, this Latino phenomenon, can dissolve in 50 years, maybe.
Yeah.
Just like it happened, because in the end, every American has a different background, and they, at some point, some of them were Polish, Dutch, and now they are all Americans. So will this happen to the Latino community as well? Thank you.
It's a fabulous question, and actually this is where a lot of my research has been going, is to understand how Hispanic identity might be changing over the decades. Couple of data points first. So there are about 40 million people in the United States who speak Spanish at home. 38 million of those are people who say they're Hispanic or Latino. And it's the second most spoken non-English language, the first most spoken non-English language in the United States. So it's English is the most spoken, then Spanish is second, and then the nearest one is Chinese at about 2.5 million or so. So when you think about Spanish is widely spoken in the United States, and it is an important part of the U.S. experience. It's influencing and impacting a lot of things. However, as you noted, by that third generation, you see people being English dominant. Spanish sort of falls to the wayside. Why is that happening? Well, in our surveys, we've asked Hispanics, do you think it's important that future generations of Hispanics in the United States speak Spanish? 95% of Latinos in the United States say, yeah, they should. So there's a desire to speak it to some extent and want it for the future. You talk to Hispanic parents, they'll say, I'm trying really hard to teach my kids to speak Spanish at home. And when I was growing up, my mom would have what were called Spanish Saturdays. And I used to hate them. I won't lie to you. I hated them a lot. Because I'm English. I spoke English first, my first language. But I couldn't get anything to eat, no water, no nothing, unless I asked for it in Spanish. A lot of U.S. Hispanic parents are doing the same, trying to teach Spanish to their children, but in many respects, you ask them, they say, oh, it's really hard. Yeah, I can't get them to, I'm fighting television, I'm fighting the schools. And you asked about policy. There is no policy in the United States about being bilingual. You can take courses if you want in high school to learn a second language, but even people who are Spanish speakers first and go into U.S. public schools, they may get placed into a program called bilingual education. But really what's happening is they're learning English and learning all the formalities of English while still taking some courses in Spanish, but their Spanish isn't necessarily being cultivated in the same way. They're not learning all the grammar and so forth and language, vocabulary of Spanish the way they are with English. So you run into a lot of young Latinos who are fluent in Spanish, can talk to you in Spanish, fine, they can do a little charla here and there, that's fine. But when it comes to something professional in business, they're unable to really communicate. You could see they feel shy because they're unsure about communicating in a professional way. So we are perhaps seeing among Latinos in the United States, yeah, Spanish kind of continues, but there's no formal training in it. Now, one other data point. About a year ago, we asked Hispanics in the United States, do you have to speak Spanish to be considered Hispanic in the United States? 71% of Latino adults said, no, you don't have to. So even among immigrant Hispanics, about half said, no, you don't have to. So there's a sense that you can be of this heritage in the United States, but not necessarily speak Spanish. So even though many say they want to future generations to speak Spanish, they try to teach it to their children as well. In reality, the proof is in the pudding. And we're seeing the loss of language into that second or third generation. And it's really what you see happening, or what you saw happen with the Germans, what you saw happen with Greek immigrants to the United States, Italians. Much of the same story has happened. It's just that Latinos are kind of still towards the beginning of that story. The Asian immigrants are really at the beginning of that. And it's something that's sort of a pattern that we see in the United States and, frankly, elsewhere around the world. It's not unusual in other parts of the world, too. So, yeah.
One or two more questions?
While we're waiting for another question, one thing that that happened with me, it's interesting, and we were just talking about it earlier. So English was my first language. Took classes in Spanish at school, high school. Remember having a hard time with the subjunctive, still have a hard time with it. But came to the job that I'm in now. And for my job, I need to be able to communicate in Spanish to the news media and also to many different audiences. Like here in Spain, I travel Latin America do a lot of talks around Latin America. And at the Pew Research Center gave me a chance to meet with a tutor. So I was able to train with a tutor one-on-one. And over the course of about 2 to 3 years, really improved my Spanish to the point where I could do press interviews on a dime without thinking about it, just show up and do a talk and just talk. That took some time to get there, but perhaps most interestingly, I used to think that people in my family were all fluent in Spanish, and I was the only one who didn't speak Spanish. I thought, oh my God, I'm really a laggard here. But guess what? After having learned and become fluent in Spanish, I realized, my her Spanish is good, but it was a lot of this very informal household Spanish. I realized that my aunts, who had all these documents from Mexico from my grandmother when she passed away, they couldn't translate them. They didn't know what they were. And I thought everybody spoke Spanish. But I learned that eventually I became the most fluent in my family in terms of Spanish. And I'm just like, wow. I was kind of blown away by that. So, and I translated all those documents, by the way. So,
but I consider myself Spanish, and I wanted to ask you about the discrimination. Any data about discrimination? Because, the United States being so diverse, did you encounter any statistics are people who are of Hispanic origin or certain Hispanic origins, do they have to face more discrimination in work or other, in society?
So we've asked this survey question many times in our surveys, although I have to say we haven't asked it recently in a Pew Research Center survey of Latinos. But we have found that about a third of Hispanics will say they've experienced discrimination in the last 5 years or so. And sometimes it's on the job, sometimes it's at school, sometimes it's just trying to go shopping at a store, they might encounter something. And it seems to be largely those who might consider themselves to be either of Caribbean, like Dominican or Cuban or Puerto Rican, or who say that their race is black. So oftentimes it seems to be tied to skin color in some way. But yes, we have seen in our surveys, Latinos report that they have experienced discrimination.
Thank you, Mark. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos hoy.
Sí, muchas gracias por la oportunidad.
Muchas gracias también, embajador, y gracias a ustedes por su atención y por las preguntas. Clausuramos el acto.